Hello, welcome to Eldership for Leaders. And so today I am delighted that I would say if you feel like an old friend to me, Linda, even though we've not known each other a lot, I feel like we went deep. So
Yes.
I want to introduce Linda to the community and for her to share her story as well. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Linda before we start. And I would really encourage you to look at Linda's website because it's just absolutely beautiful and delightful, and really will paint a much better picture than what I could paint here. But some of the things I think that kind of stood out to me, Linda, when I kind of found out more about you and the work that you do, is this. I suppose what spoke to me was your wild authenticity. So that
Mm,
was the bit that kind of stood out to me. That wildness was
mm,
very much kind of called spiritually to
mm.
me as well. So that felt beautiful. And you mentioned on your website that the first leg of what you're calling your journey was that you discovered your wild authenticity, and
Mm.
basically that to you meant the untamed part of yourself.
Yes.
And the second half of the journey, so you kind of split it in two halves, was what you're defining as the heroine's journey. And I
Mhm.
know we hear a lot about the hero's journey, but we very rarely hear people talk about the heroine's journey as well, or realizing that it's actually a different thing. Um, and that's when you said, when there was no more external cages to escape from. No more external cages to escape from. So that metaphor really, really spoke to me. And you said I had to face the cold, hard truth that there was a cage within me. So
Mm.
an inner cage that I carried with me everywhere I went. And that for me kind of really speaks to me a little bit about eldership as well, in terms of us perhaps feeling like we've maybe separated ourselves away from certain systems, but maybe there's still a
Mhm.
system operating internally that's hidden and maybe we can't see yet.
Yeah.
And you said it didn't matter where you lived or what you was doing or who you was with, the cage remained. Dismantling that inner cage became the heroine's journey of a lifetime.
Mm.
And you said you needed to contemplate and to exist behind the scenes and create the framework of the inner cage that you work with now. So we're
Mhm.
kind of building new infrastructures as well, is what and new systems and structures, which is how it spoke to me. And
Yeah.
this is the bit, Linda, why I wanted you to come and talk to us on this podcast, as you said, which is the dynamic of the good girl, the rebel, and the tyrant king.
Yeah.
And it's and particularly that tyrant king, when we spoke about it, when you talked to me about it, it really, you brought something to life for me that I hadn't seen in the way that you described it. So
Mm.
that's I'm looking forward to us getting into that. And you said you spent the last decade of your life on a quest to find my wild. And you said you looked for it everywhere outside of yourself, but now you know that it was lying dormant within you all along, waiting for me to call it back to life.
Mm.
Yeah. Oh, it's so
Yes.
it's nice. And I was just before we kind of got on, I wanted to find out a little bit more about you, Linda, and I didn't know that you'd majored in fine art and that you were into drawing and painting, but then, as we will get on to talking about, no doubt, the Tyrant King kind of came into play, and you ended up thinking about, well, what am I going to do with this? And
Mhm.
ended up going there, taking it into graphic design and digital photography, and ultimately
Yeah.
marketing.
Yeah.
Well,
Not the same. I was hoping that it was close enough, quote unquote, right? To the small pivots, the small sacrifices that we make that we're like, oh, this is close enough to drawing and painting. This is close enough to that soulful expression. And it was not.
damn.
I know. I wish it had been, but it was not my experience.
And it's important for me to say that you are a coach and a dream worker, and I'm sure you'll say a little bit more about that. And you're the author of the book Homecoming as
Yeah.
well. And
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and just to say as well, I think it's important to say that we met through Tad Hargrave's Marketing for Hippies program. Just shortly, I think it was around the pandemic time, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I
we
started in
were
2020.
Yeah, we were on his mentorship program. So yeah, we that was a deep dive, I think, for everybody who was involved in that at that time. I think with the backdrop of the pandemic as well, it made it probably a much deeper dive for most people than it would have been. So yeah,
Yeah.
and ever since. So um, the other thing I just wanted to mention before we kind of start is I always pick a card. Most of you know this. I always pick a card to kind of guide us, a little bit of a guidance as to what maybe our conversation will be today. And we've picked the card of the threshold today, which
Mm.
we're excited about, which is about stepping into the unknown.
Yes, which feels so appropriate for this conversation of kind of midwifing this old way of being, right? This old way of old systems dying away. And it's kind of a larger collective and individual stepping into something that we have not seen in our lifetime. And like I've been using this phrase a lot recently where I'm like, I want to get out of the matrix. And
Mm,
it's this sense of, I don't even quite know what that means yet, right? It's like I can start to envision it, I can imagine parts of it, but really so much is still unknown, even in my personal life, that to let go, to be in that threshold is really to be in that liminal space, to be in that in between when it's like, okay, I know that what was isn't working individually, collectively, culturally. And we want to move towards something, at least I'll speak for myself. I want to move towards something that is more beautiful, more meaningful, more sustainable for all of life. And, kind of straddling this space between
mm,
is kind of what that card said to me was like, oh, as we leave what I call the kind of tyrant king paradigm, as you alluded to, and moving towards kind of that wise and wild essence, it's it's like, how do we do that? And how do we, when we don't know exactly where we're moving towards, how do we source that trust? How do we source that confidence? Where does it come from as we step into this kind of unknown way of being?
mm. And I think that was what was so lovely about us all being together in 2020 on that program as well, in terms of everybody was in that space, weren't they? I don't just mean as in like we were in the liminal space of the pandemic, but in a way we were the people that kind of gathered in that space were also bringing their gifts to the liminal space as well and sharing them with one another, which was beautiful at the time, absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
So there was that
Yeah.
sense of community there, wasn't there, amongst us in terms of, so that I think sometimes we think that liminal space we're on our own. And obviously, yes, our
Mhm.
inner journey is our journey, but also there was other people there to support and guide us through that journey as well, and through being able to step into that unknown. Because what emerged for me out of that work was the eldership work.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think that's a huge piece of it because the community aspect, I think, is so vital, right? That we can lean on one another and we have these different strands of work and different strands of what we're birthing into being.
Mhm.
And to have the people who are supporting us there, I think is so important. Um, because the old system is still quite large. It's still quite dominant. And so, it's like when we try to share, if we try to share our work in places where maybe quite it's not as receptive, places that aren't as receptive to it, it can be really soul crushing if we think that we have to carry it solely on our own. To have these spaces where people understand, even just that, like understand and resonate with what it is that we're doing, it can be such a bolster and give us that extra courage. And it's so much more fun, I think, to do it together than it is to be like, I'm gonna slog through on my own. That's the old way. Like, I'm going to be the savior of the thing and I'm going to, have to armor up to go out into the world. It's like we've done that. Um,
Yeah,
and I think this new way is different.
that time of the John Wayne hero or conquering
Yes.
hero, or even the
Yes.
Wonder Woman. it's
Yes.
it's like no, no, we don't do this on our own.
Yeah.
This is too big as well, isn't it? It's far too big. I mean, I think you know one of the things that really called to me in your work and when we were sharing our work with each other was this concept of the good girl, the rebel, and the tyrant. And I'd never really uh, looked at it the way that you looked at it before.
Mm.
So you kind of brought really new perspectives on this for me. So can you say a
Mm.
little bit more about what you mean by the good girl, the rebel gang, and the tyrant? What does that mean to you? And what was that? How did you find those parts of yourself?
Yeah, I think that was a framework that really was born out of my own journey. So as you kind of stated at the top of our call or our chat, I had spent 5 years kind of breaking out of a lot of what I call now like the external cages in my life. It was around I think 2009, 2010, that I started to look out at my life. I was in my late 20s, right around my first Saturn return, for those who are astrologically minded. And I looked out at my life and I realized, oh my gosh, I've wandered so far away from myself. I remember being 14 and looking out at the world and being like, I'm never going to work in a cubicle. I'm never going to, like there was just this, like, what are you adults doing? Like, it just seemed like the whole adult world was such a big, it looks awful to me. I'm never going to do it. And then, life happens and you do it sometimes. So at least I did. And so I remember having this moment of waking up and realizing that I was like, I've wandered really far away from myself. I looked out at my life and it didn't feel like my own, even though, of course, I, quote unquote, had made the choices to get to that point. And so then I started breaking out of all the external cages. I left my job. A relationship ended that I had been in for a long time. I met my husband. We moved from Los Angeles to Austin, Texas. I started all these new hobbies. I had to make new friends because I was living in a new city. So really between, 2010 and 2015, my whole life on the outside changed. But sadly, to my own chagrin and frustration, I didn't feel any wilder, any more like myself, any more freedom in some kind of, more intangible way. And that was when I found myself, I found my way to my longtime mentor, Leanne Raymond. And so much of kind of what I now call the inner cage, that became the next 5 years of the journey, were about dismantling the inner cage. And that's still a journey, I'll be honest, that is ongoing, right? I wish I could say that it's, these kind of cultural stories of I went through the journey and now here I am and I'm free and everything's great. It's like, no, it's a process. And so that what I think of the inner cage as is kind of the places where we've absorbed patriarchal conditioning. And just like you said, it's the even when we break out of the systems that we know aren't serving life, that sometimes we carry those systems within us because we're a product of this civilization. We're a product of this society, even when we don't necessarily want to be, at least in my case, right? And so I started to realize that I had these patterns within me that prevented me from showing up the way that I wanted to. So the kind of the feminine to me was broken into two pieces. There was the good girl, which is all about compliance, right? That's an energy. It's one of people pleasing. It's one of perfectionism. It's the way to be safe is to be small. It's kind of the fawning response. Um, And much to my chagrin, I started to see how in a lot of places I had been that good girl, right? I had stifled my voice. I had avoided conflict by being who I thought other people wanted me to be. So another aspect of the good girl is that it's a lot of the chameleon behavior,
Yeah.
which
And
is that,
I
yeah.
suppose that helps us kind of safely belong in these systems as well, doesn't it?
Oh, 100%, right? It's like you have the saying, right? It's like the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. So it's like, I will not stick out. And the way to not stick out is that I can sense like, oh, you like this thing, this aspect of me, so I'm going to bring that forth. And you respond to this, so I'm going to bring that forth. And it becomes unconscious, so we don't even really know that we're doing it. And over time, I found that I didn't even know who I was, because when you get really good at being the good girl for a long time, you lose track of what is actually true for you.
Mm.
And so we have kind of that's one part of it. And then we have the rebel. So where the good girl complies, the rebel defies. And the rebel, I think, is what we're seeing and have seen a lot recently. Um, as people are becoming more aware of kind of the good girl energy, the initial response that ends up being part of the trap is to feel utter disgust. Because the good girl, when we see her in ourselves, and especially for the first time, if that's not, not what we thought we were, it's not our own self-image that we have concocted, she feels really weak. And it can be like, oh God, I can't believe that I didn't speak up, I didn't do this, right? So we bring a lot of this like kind of self-hatred and frustration towards ourselves, and that really just keeps us stuck, right? It keeps us battling at war with ourselves. It keeps us split. And what oftentimes happens is that we swing the pendulum from the good girl into kind of her shadow sister, the rebel. And the rebel, she has a place. All of these energies, they have the good stuff in them too, right? Like there's the beauty of the good girl in kindness, in empathy, in being able to sense how another person is feeling. We don't want to get rid of that, so to speak. And the rebel can give us this important space to be able to find our authenticity. But with the rebel, we still end up in the trap, because to kind of put it in your language, we're still defying the system, right? Or we think of an adolescent, right? It's we're still living in reaction to our parents or to an authority figure. So when we're in the good girl, we're like, I'll comply with whatever that quote unquote authority figure is, because that's where I source my safety and my sense of self. But in the rebel, we're like, I'm going to do the exact opposite of that. I'm going to defy this system. I'm going to defy, my parents or whatever it is. But that's not true for us either, because if we take away what it is that we're defying, we don't actually know who we are.
Mm.
We don't actually know why we're doing this. Like we're still living in reaction.
Mm. So is that
Yeah.
like as well, Linda, like we're fighting against something rather than for something? Because I certainly like
Yes.
when we talk about eldership, that rebellious energy is in eldership.
Yeah.
But actually it is, but it's much more kind of a moving forward energy that goes, okay, what do we believe in?
Yeah.
What do we stand for? Are we going to start speaking truth to power? So then, therefore, then we might appear like we're the rebels in the system, because
Yes.
suddenly start telling the truth about things. So,
Yes.
so there's the fighting against versus fighting for. That's how I would kind of look at it.
Yes.
Mm.
That's a great way of saying it. And I think, like what you brought forth there too, I think something that's important is that sometimes when we kind of start to inhabit more of that rebel energy, what can tend to happen naturally as a byproduct, I would say, is that we harden, right? Because we're fighting. There's a lot of fighting. And so there has to be, even as we're dismantling and fighting for something that is new and that is different. I think that's where the community comes in, because there has to be spaces where we can come into our softness, where we don't have to harden against, like, I'm going to, put on my armor and speak truth to power, because there is like a certain element of that, right? That comes with being able to stand up to these giant kind of monoliths and systems. And so to have the spaces where we can also claim our softness so that um, we don't forget our armor on, I guess is one way of saying it, is that because then we lose a part of our humanity. And I think ironically, then we lose a part of what it is that we are fighting for, which is to have more humane systems, to have systems that are really rooted in Mother Earth, in our bodies, in our shared humanity, in life. And that requires us to also have our softness and tenderness intact.
Yeah, well, that feels so true, because I think it's still being able to hold on to that compassion, isn't it? And if we're not careful, if we get lost in that rebellious energy, then, like you said, we get stuck in fighting.
Yeah.
And
We're like going through life with like both middle fingers up all the time, right? It's like, come at me.
in the rage. It's like
Yeah.
stuck in the rage, isn't it?
Yes.
Not kind of alchemizing the rage into something,
Yes.
something
And I
new.
often say that for when we're moving, and this is obviously, kind of, I work with women, so that's why I use the frame, the good girl, but, we could use it for any gender, right? Is as we're moving from that kind of space of compliance or people pleasing into what I call that kind of more wise and wild essence, we do need to travel through the rebel, right? We do need to claim our rage, because I think especially for women, that is anger is an emotion that's been a big no-no, right? Because
We're
it's
not a good girl if we're angry.
no, exactly, because that also anger ties us back to our power, right? Anger has the fire to it. And the good girl kind of has a sense of being helpless, right? Like, especially for the feminine, is like, oh, poor me, kind of the damsel in distress that needs to be rescued. And so we need to claim that. We need to claim that rage and that anger, and to use it and to work with it. But like you said, to not just get stuck there and forget about the joy and the grief and the love and the beauty. It's like we have to make space for all of it.
So the Tyrant King then.
Oh, the Tyrant King. Okay, so I kind of consider the good girl and the rebel to be like the split off feminine, like they're two aspects of the feminine. The Tyrant King, one way of thinking about it is that and I describe all of these things as energies, or the Tyrant King to me is also, it's like a consciousness, and it is a dysfunctional kind of masculine energy. And what I mean by that is that it is dysfunctional is because it has split off from the quote unquote feminine. And it has, rather than being side by side, it's stacked on top. So it looks at everything in terms of hierarchies. So some of the ways that we might see the energy of the Tyrant King in our culture is that we have split thinking from feeling. And we put thinking on top of feeling, right? Thinking is like rational thought is the most important thing, and feelings are fickle and not to be trusted, right? We've buried our feelings, we've buried our vulnerability. We also see this in terms of like mind over matter or spirit over matter, which again has left our matter, whether it is the matter of our human bodies, other bodies, the body of the earth herself, ailing. Um, so that's one aspect of this kind of energy. I'd say another way that it shows up is in kind of extreme judgment and black or white thinking. So the Tyrant King is very uncomfortable with nuance and gray area and unknowns. And so it's tied also to kind of a sense of fundamentalism, because there is a perceived sense of safety and comfort in making things known. And the best way to make things known, or the easiest way, I should say, not the best way to make things known, but the easiest way is to split things into binaries, where we have it's either it's black or it's white, it's good or it's bad, it's right or it's wrong. And so we see that a lot, rather than being able to step into greater nuance, to step into messy gray areas. When we are under the spell of the Tyrant King, the absolute worst thing that we could say is, I don't know.
Mm.
Right. And that's a way that, again, all of these energies also in their own way, the good girl, rebel, and the Tyrant King, are terrified of vulnerability. And they have their own ways of trying to steal themselves from that. And I would say the main way that the Tyrant King does that is through kind of the seeing the world in these oppositional binaries that make the choices for us, right? Because if we see something as black or white, as good or bad, we're going to go for the one typically that is good, right? And it makes the choices, it makes our individual choice kind of limited. Another way that I think that this shows up a lot, that we can know that we're under the spell of the Tyrant King within ourselves, is there's a lot of shoulds, right? It's like, I should do this, you should do that, right? It's there's a lot of edicts, there's a lot of rules. And so when we have that voice and that kind of system running through our minds and our bodies, what happens is that the good girl will comply, right? So this can happen. It happens in interpersonal relationships, but also happens, these energies, how they react to one another and respond to one another within us. It's fascinating. We're fascinating as human beings, but it's, if I'm saying, like, I'm creating all these rules for myself, I should do this, I should do that, I should do that. We have the good girl who's like, okay, I'm going to try to keep up because this is what it means to be good. This is what it means to be perfect. This is how I protect myself. And then we have the rebel will come in and we will rebel against ourselves, right? We rebel against our inner rule maker and our inner taskmaster. And it's like, man, I'm not going to do this. I think of like the whole diet industry is based upon this, right? It's like, I'm going to listen to the Tyrant King out there who's going to tell me what to eat and what's good for me and what's not good for me. I'm going to internalize that. My good girl is going to be like, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to take care of myself, right? But it's not coming from this place of I'm going to take care of myself. It's coming from like, I'm going to be good this time. And then we try and we tighten and like, we're on the straight and narrow until we have a shitty day at work, until we have a fight with our spouse. And all of a sudden it's like, the lid is blown off, the rebel comes out, and then again, we're reacting to the rules that we are making for ourselves. Because again, these things aren't sourced from our deepest truth. They're not sourced from our wise and wild self. They're sourced from some other Tyrant King out there that's telling us what we should and should not do, as if we are the only animal in the history of the world that doesn't know how to, like, what is good for us. What feels good in our bodies, like what feels like, it's like, oh, I have this and I feel really energized and I feel great, or I eat this and I get really bloated and I feel exhausted. But because we're so separated from our bodies, we're so cut off at the neck, it's like we no longer trust that we even know. And so we need to have these other authorities.
And it feels like, it feels like kind of the Tyrant King kind of blocks our intuition, our capacity, like you said, our capacity to tune in our felt sense and tune into our inner worlds and go, what feels right, what feels true for me, what feels good for me in this moment. It's like that's what seems to kind of block it. And I just wanted to pick up this because I think that it's fascinating how we call it a king, and obviously I totally agree with you in terms of it's masculine energy and it's dysfunctional masculine energy. But I remember kind of watching I think it was a program called The Ascent of Woman, which was really interesting. And and I think it was that program, because there was a few that I'd watched around the time, and they were talking about kind of the history of queens. They
Mm.
said, well, actually, there was no such thing as a queen. So the first woman became a king in England. They didn't actually become a queen, because the word king means
Yeah.
the head of and the leader
Ah.
of a nation. Not it's not attached to a masculine,
Ah.
male, if you like. And that
Yeah.
blew me away, because I
I had
thought,
no idea.
that's fascinating, because actually then it's a function within the system, rather than,
Uh-huh.
an identity of man and woman.
Mm.
If you're a leader, you're a queen. And you're female, if you're a leader and you're a man, you're a king.
Yeah.
And how we, kind of unconsciously maybe put king above queen, all that
Mm-hmm.
kind of stuff. It's like, no,
Mm-hmm.
the king is basically the ruler,
Ah.
the ruler of the kingdom. And it's like,
Yes.
that speaks to me, because
Yeah.
actually your tyrant king could be your mother, you know,
Yes.
not your father. I think we assume,
Totally.
because it's like patriarchy, we genderize it, when actually
Mm-hmm.
not gender, it's actually to do with ruler, and
Yeah.
that kind of the tyrant ruler, that
Yes.
we're in, responding and reacting to, and that's the inner ruler, and obviously within the systems as well. So
Yeah. That's so cool. I'd never heard of that, and that makes complete sense. And it just to clarify too, because I know a lot of times the terms masculine and feminine, they're very loaded in our culture. The way that I kind of perceive them, and yes, okay, they have a tendency historically over the last few thousand years to align with gender, but to me, they're completely separate from our gender. They're like two different types of energies that can show up in any gender. And like you were saying, like the tyrant king could be your mother, like I can be the tyrant king. There's no right, it doesn't have to follow along those lines. So I love the way that you brought that forth. And there was something that you said that I wanted to kind of elaborate on, where you said that the tyrant king kind of blocks our intuition. It blocks our ability to sense and feel what is true for me. And I think that is those two words, for me, I think are really big. Because again, it's like when we are in that kind of tyrant king consciousness, there is no space for that. There is no space for this feels true for me, but I can trust that you know what feels true for you, even if it's different from me,
mm,
without it threatening my sense of identity. And when we're in the tyrant king, there's no, this is true for me and this is true for you. Even it's something as basic as, again, I might use food just because it's like a natural product of being a human being, right? But there's very little space for that because, again, we fall, like the tyrant king brings that black or white, good or bad, right or wrong. So if it's not right for me, it can't be right for you,
mm,
because then that throws everything for me into question. And so again, to have something be true for me requires nuance. It requires pause. It requires questioning. It requires flexibility to be able to say and to meet another then with curiosity rather than judgment and having already defined another person, right? It's like, oh, what is this is true for me. What is true for you? Help me understand you. Help me understand where you're coming from so that we can start to connect on that very human level rather than on this level of ideology alone and, you know, the great big sweeping gesture of good or bad, right or wrong. Yeah.
mm, mm. So as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of this, we got together through looking at our niche,
Mhm.
and then putting our niche out into the world. And um, now the work that I'm doing is around eldership niche. So
Yeah.
this next stage of life, what does that look like?
Mm,
So, but what's brilliant is that obviously you pretty early on, I would say, kind of kind of a connected to this concept of niche, and I'm just kind of
mm,
wondering how that's helped you in your work, in
mm.
your life, in terms of being able to define niche. And I just want to say as well
Yeah.
that we know that this changes all the time. So I think sometimes when we go niche, got to nail it. I've got to nail it. I've got to know what that is, and it's like, no, you just kind of feel your way with it, don't you?
Uh-huh.
It's kind of you get more and more clarity, and then there's a moment when it shifts again, and there's a movement
Mhm,
again. So so I just want to kind of put voice to that, because I know that a
mhm.
lot, and certainly when I started, I was like, I've really got to nail this niche. I've
And that's,
really got to nail it. I've got to be able to, I've got to know what that is. And it was
yeah.
like this like real longing to find it. And then when I started to kind of go, well, let's just experiment with it. Suddenly the whole
Mhm,
thing just kind of started to change, really. And I just, had the kind of courage to put ideas out there and see what
mhm,
kind of I felt connected to, and what I didn't feel
mhm.
connected to, and also what people who I wanted to work with connected with and didn't connect with. So all that kind of stuff was really, really useful. That's
Yeah.
when it started to work for me. But you, I mean, you started a lot younger than me in terms of finding your niche. So I'm
Well, and it's funny because I feel like it's a constant flux, right? I love that it appears like it's well defined, but I think it's for me too, it's in motion. And I think the part, there's the core of it that I think remains the same, right? Like that, um, and I think that is important because it ties in with my kind of greater why of why I do this work. But the way that I speak of it, I think is very much still is in the experimentation phase, to notice like what are the things that I say that people respond to. What are the things, because sometimes when I speak about the Tyrant King, some people are like, yes, and maybe those are my niche, but a lot of people are like, it's just, it's not something that is well known,
Mm.
in the culture. And so for me, it has been this interesting, journey with wanting to hold and maintain the breadth and the depth of the niche, so to speak, and the work, while also making doorways that feel a bit more accessible so that the people can say, oh, that's me, and oh, that's me. And so one of the ways that I've, for the most part over the last several years, I've worked with other, female entrepreneurs. I think because, it kind of mirrors my own journey in part. And I think that a lot of people who have gone down that path, whether they consciously would call it as such or not, or want to move away from the kind of dominant tyrant king paradigm. They're hungry for something else. But right now, a new niche that I'm exploring that I'm kind of in that space of like, I don't know. We'll see how this is so I have my relationship. I love animals. I love nature. I particularly love dogs. And I have found, I live in a suburb of Dallas. So it's not like I live out, in the mountainside, hopefully one day. But to me, I've found that dogs and animals, but particularly canines, can be this our connection point to the wild, a connection point, an invitation back into our bodies, back into this other way of being. And so one of the ways that I'm looking to kind of move into the and exploring this wise and wild essence is for dog owners.
Mm.
And so rather than training dogs solely how to live in the human world, which that's extremely important, we need that. But dogs can also help us. I realized that my dog, Sophie, who passed away last August, she was really the catalyst to my journey. I didn't see it until she passed. But that change point, right? That change that I described, that initial like waking up of like, what am I doing? It started when I got her.
Mm. wow.
And then she passed away 3 days after my book came out,
Oh, bless.
called Homecoming. And
Yeah.
so it was like, and at that point I realized, I was like, oh my God, this wasn't just my journey. This was our journey. And she was a teacher and continues to be a teacher for me on how to come back more into this wise and wild self, because animals don't live in the plane of the Tyrant King. Right? And for a while I would try to, impose that upon her, but the more that I can step into my wise and wild essence, the more joyful my connections with not only other humans become, but with dogs, with the natural world, with all of these things. So it's interesting that you say that. It's like niche to me is this ever evolving thing of finding what feels alive, of having that openness and that curiosity, like you were saying, to experiment. Because I think, again, that what the Tyrant King Good Girl combo will have us believe is like, we go and we sit in front of our computer and we figure everything out and we craft this thing in a silo. I did that for a long time. And then we're like, crickets? No one? No one resonates with this except for me. And so it's like, it's a whole different way of being when we step into this, like, okay, let me just start talking about this and see what happens. Let me see how it lands. And there's not this uh, attachment to an end goal necessarily. It's like, it's an openness to what is present, to what feels alive, and it becomes part of the greater conversation
Yeah.
with the world, with the universe.
It's like I got this image of a little tapestry, and like we've got another little thread that's coming in, and we're weaving that,
Mm-hmm.
today.
Yes.
And
Yes.
also there's a real vulnerability in that thread. That like, oh, how's that going to affect the other little threads? And
Uh-huh.
how will it change, what it looks like? And so,
Yeah.
when we bring that thread in. So I mean, I have to say I felt very excited when you talked about the dog. And really resonated with me because I know in like the field, into the systemic field, there's a lot of work around horses, for instance, and using horses
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
constellate with, which is always been, I've never looked at it, but it fascinates me, and I think I totally get it. But
Yeah.
I also know from my own experience of having dogs, how I totally resonate with what you've just said. And I remember the last dog we had, who sadly died in the pandemic, she was half a Rottweiler and
Mm.
half a Cocker Spaniel. So she looked like this huge black Cocker Spaniel.
So cute.
Which used to amuse me no end, because people would go, "Oh, isn't she cute?" And then she'd go, "Woof." And then you'd go, "Whoa." Like, where's that come from? It's like, that's the Rottweiler.
I also wonder, I'm like, was that a little bit like you back in the day? You were like, I look really cute. And then it's like, woof, I've got all of this energy and all of this.
You're probably not wrong there. But what was amazing, but when she was the wildest and dog I'd had, and she wasn't vicious, but
Yeah.
she was so connected to the wild. She was loved being out in nature, and you saw her come to life when she was out there,
Mm-hmm.
and she was incredibly protective. But you couldn't control her. So if you like, I couldn't overpower it. Like I'd had other dogs before where I just instinctively overpowered them, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of training them. Whereas this,
Mm-hmm.
she taught me so much, because it was like,
Mm-hmm.
no,
Mm-hmm.
I can take you out, so let's not have that conversation. So, like, are you the pat leader or not? And
Uh-huh.
I really got into Caesar Milan's work.
Uh-huh.
The dog was like, I need something deeper and bigger, because I can't seem to get to grips with that. And of course, his work, and he does work on leadership as well, which I think is fascinating, because of course he's training the human to understand
Mhm.
kind of the system, how the dog works
Mhm.
in system. It doesn't work as an individual. So it sees the system. So therefore, if there's a void in the system, as in like if there's not a leader that it can respect, then it's going to take the role of the leader. Yeah, and it's like, oh, so what do I need to do to step into that role? You know,
Yes.
and become much more fully present in the system in terms of
Yeah.
the power of the lead of that leadership role. And
Yes.
and then suddenly she calmed down. It was fascinating. So I was like, okay, yeah, you've got this. But I knew when I hadn't got it because she let me know. It's like,
Yep.
you're not holding the power in the system. So she'd, she'd kind of start to try and dominate me. And it was just fascinating. So I'm totally with you in terms of that connection to, I mean, for me, it was a connection to the system and understanding the system. It's obviously looking at it through a dog's eyes. But it was also that nature. I think she was so beautifully wild. And she absolutely came to life in the wild. She, like her whole energy and her essence was just beautiful in the wild. The joy that it was, and so I saw that through her as well. And we used to go out in storms and do all sorts of wild stuff together and she loved the water, and because I felt like, oh, this and this is, and it kind of for me connected me back to my childhood when I was spent most of my time in the wild. So it was like, wow, that energy kind of came back in, and that joy of and that feeling of aliveness as well. So yeah, I'm excited to see how
It's
spread in.
I'm excited about the thread too, because I think it's, like you were saying, I think our dogs can teach us so much. And the ways that we have thought of leadership, or the way that we have, like so much of it ends up being really disembodied. And it's like animals are energetic, like they're energetic creatures. And I remember when I got Sophie, and she was a handful too. And again, sometimes it's like we want to break the animal, right? We want them to, I want you to,
yeah.
And it's like Sophie was the same, and pit bulls and bully breeds, which was what she was and what we have now. She would not relinquish her sovereignty to me. And so she taught me to see her as a sovereign being, which was, for me at the time, it was like that was a disconnect between what I thought of myself and how I saw the world and how I actually responded in the world. Was that I wanted her to please me. I wanted her to always listen to me, right? It was, and it really is that they can guide us into these different energies, into the wildness, into leadership. When I first got her, I remember also watching Caesar Milan, because she would start, once she was about 6 months or so, and she was almost full grown. So she was like 65 pounds of like pure muscle. And whenever we would go out on the walk, she would jump for the leash and then have it be like a tug of war toy. And I remember being like, I would come home from walks in tears. And I remember starting to watch Caesar Milan. He's like, that calm energy. But I was so disconnected from myself that I had no idea that I wasn't calm. And that's the kind of stuff, right? It's like that to me is the wise and wild essence, is we have to be aware of the energy that we're in to know what it is that we're putting out into the world, because we can't fake it with our animals. And I think what I love about dogs is that, in addition to what you were saying, I had never heard of using horses in constellation work. That's fascinating. But here, what I'm seeing too in the US is a lot of using them in coaching, like working with horses and coaching in terms of like leadership and energy, which I think is fantastic. But such a huge portion of the population has dogs that they're an energy, they're teachers that we can work with right in our very own home. And again, like you were saying, they will show you where your vacuums, your leadership vacuums are. They will show you, are you actually, do you have boundaries or not? Because they will just run right over you if you don't, it's, and they don't lie.
No. And
You can't fool them.
They work off the energy. So it kind of tells you what, like you said, what the truth is. It's
Hmm.
sort of like what's the truth?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think I took so much into that, into certainly at the time in my leadership work, in terms of
Yeah.
understanding the kind of the system. And yeah,
Yeah.
and really understanding that the dog is part, is tuned into the system, whether, it's not just when we talk about systems and relationship
Mm.
systems, it's not just about people, it's about dogs as well. And so
Yeah.
like, how do we work with the dog? So yeah, absolutely love. So I'm really interested. That sounds like this is going to be weaved into your eldership niche, Linda, to me.
I could totally see that. It's something that I keep coming back to, that I've come back to. I circle back and around. I've been coaching for 10 years, but it's something that has been, I would go and I would kind of explore it and be like, this is fun. I've noticed this. And then I would put it aside. It would be like the call would come, but I would not be ready to answer it. And I would always have a ready excuse of like, yeah, but I need to go get a training and da 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 da. But I'm like, this isn't about training the dog, right? That's a whole different skill set. That's a whole different desire and outcome. This is about like untraining the human from the Tyrant King so that we can connect
Yeah.
in this more ancient, embodied, rooted, natural, and wild way.
Wow. That's fantastic.
I
Well,
love that you asked that question because I'm like, I haven't really talked about it a lot. I'm just it's the thread, it's the tiny thread that feels really precious that I'm like, boop, I put in like one stitch and then I'm like, okay, maybe one more stitch.
and that is what happens in niche, isn't it? Kind of something keeps coming into your awareness that you're going, well, I don't
Mhm.
understand how am I going to weave that in? How am
Uh-huh.
I going to weave that? And often you leave it then. It's
Uh-huh.
like an
Yep.
item of clothing in your wardrobe going, I've got nothing to go with it. So it's
Yeah.
just gonna have to sit there. I love it, but it's just gonna have to sit there until I've worked out.
Yes, exactly. And then
But
it just keeps
how can
popping back.
I fit
It will not be denied. That's the thing, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Oh no, that's brilliant. Thank you, Lynn, and thank you so much for this podcast today. It's been amazing and really, really interesting. And I'm no doubt we'll come back to even more exploration. So I'm really interested to find out how you go with your this little next piece of the niche.
Oh.
And so how can people find you and your work then? So just tell everybody how they can find you.
So I would say the best place if you're interested in kind of doing a deep dive, because like I said, the breadth and the depth, it doesn't lend itself as well to social media posts, though I am on Instagram at Singing Bird Coaching. But I would recommend checking out the book, which is called Homecoming: One Woman's Story of Dismantling the Inner Cage and Freeing Her Wild Feminine Soul. And if you are if anything that we shared today and spoke about today in terms of the Tyrant King, the good girl, the rebel, uh, this is where I go into greater detail and share through stories because I think that's often makes it easier to understand these things. It can be a little bit heady, is sharing how they have shown up in my life, how they show up in clients' lives. Um, yeah, so that would be, and then my website is singingbirdcoaching.com. So
Wonderful.
any of those
And
places.
for me, the work that you're doing very much kind of fits in to the rites of passage for women. So,
Yes.
that's if people are interested in, if they feel like they've either not explored that before, or that they feel like there's something that you've said that's kind of gone, oh, hold on a minute, maybe I haven't fully been through this, my own rite of passage in terms of becoming a woman from being the good girl.
Yes.
Then so Linda is definitely your woman to contact on that. So yeah, thank you, Linda.
Oh, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been just truly a joy for me. Thank you for doing the amazing and beautiful work that you do in the world and just for being you.
Thank you. Take care. See you soon.